Our next presenter is Dr. Masuma Apil. Dr. Masuma is a graduate of Aga Khan University Medical College, class of 2007. She has completed internal medicine residency from West Virginia University, USA, and fellowship in critical pulmonary and critical care medicine from Medical College of Wisconsin. She is diplomat American Board of Internal Medicine, Pulmonary Medicine, and Critical Care Medicine. She is currently working as assistant professor in the section of pulmonary and critical care, and also taking care of COVID patients. So she would be talking about pulmonary manifestation and long-term outcomes in COVID patients. Dr. Apil, please. Yes.
So, Assalamu alaikum everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting us for this second round of teaching sessions on the COVID series. So my talk is going to cover pulmonary manifestations of COVID-19 and then the long-term outcomes that we're beginning to see with some of the patients who survived this illness. I have no disclosures. The outline of my talk is going to include common respiratory symptoms and their timelines in the illness of COVID as we understand them now. I'm going to go through the various aspects of respiratory involvement in COVID-19, particularly the pathophysiology of lung injury as we've understood it over the last 6 months or so, radiographic patterns of pulmonary parenchymal damage, the pathophysiology of pulmonary vascular damage, comparisons with past viruses such as the MERS, the SARS-CoV-1 and influenza. And then finally, I'm going to go over the long-term outcomes, including some lessons that we've learned from past pandemics. And so here I wanted to just put up a very simple chart of the most commonly identified typical symptoms for COVID-19. And as you can see here, almost more than 87% of patients will have the hallmark symptom of fever. I want to point out that the SARS coronaviruses differentiate themselves from influenza and other viral illnesses in having a very high fever profile when they first start out. It has to do with the pathogenesis of the virus itself. And so this is probably single-handedly the most important symptom that patients should not ignore. Additionally, you can see that of this list, a majority of them are a respiratory symptom. For example, dry cough, sputum production, shortness of breath, sore throat, and so on, even hemoptysis and conjunctival congestion. Although those symptoms are far less common than the ones on top of the chart shown here. And so this is as of updated as of February, very early in the course of COVID, but the ratio still stands true for the patients that we're seeing. And so this is a slide that is borrowed from one of my colleagues where I thought that it would be very easy and a nice way to depict when we expect the onset of these respiratory symptoms. So for most people, the onset of symptoms with, i.e. either fever, cough, fatigue, anorexia, usually follows after an asymptomatic incubation period of about 5 days on average, as a median. However, by day 7 or 8, about 40% of symptomatic patients will develop dyspnea or shortness of breath. And then you can see the relevant proportions there, that about 14% will go on to develop severe illness, while a very small but very critical component will require ICU admission and intensive care. I wanted to also show a little bit of a comparison in terms of epidemiology of past respiratory viral infections. And as you can see here, that the flu or at least the common cold has a lower case fatality rate. You can have COVID-19, which is hitting about 3.4% as of March, not the most recent numbers. But the number that I want to show you here is the R naught, or the basic reproductive number, which is consistently higher than those of the other respiratory illnesses that we've seen recently, including influenza and most recently MERS in 2003. The R naught obviously changes as our contact measures go into place and the community spread is curtailed. However, it is significantly higher and points to the highly infectious nature of this illness. So, to talk about respiratory pathophysiology and where we've come to in the last 5 or 6 months that have helped us understand how this virus actually affects us. So we know that there's a high expression of ACE2 receptors on the lung alveolar epithelium as well as the small intestinal epithelial cells. Here I've shown you the nasal epithelial tract as well as down in the lower respiratory tract where the pulmonary alveolus has these ACE2 receptors where the spike 2 protein of this virus is now known to bind and facilitate entry into the cell. I do want to point out that there are other epithelial cells in the body that also have the same tendency. So for example, the epithelial cells of the skin, the kidneys and the proximal tubules, etc., the oral mucosa, may also have the ACE2 receptor which can facilitate binding and entry of the SARS-CoV virus particle. And so that's important to keep in mind when we've observed the different types of organ systems that this virus has affected. And so to build on that, we know that the ACE2 combination with the virus itself is now the primary factor that facilitates cell entry. We know that this binding capacity between the two has almost 10 to 20 times higher intensity of binding or affinity than the prior SARS-CoV-1 virus responsible for MERS. And so we know that this is probably why the virus is so infectious and has such a high potency in terms of infecting larger numbers of people. Building on that further, I wanted to show how the virus in the nasal epithelium and the epithelial structures goes on to affect both the secretory and the ciliated cells of the respiratory lining. So you've got, again, this is distinct from past viruses where either or the other cell type is affected, but not both. Here, it tends to be both. You can then further on see here in this electron micrograph that the virus particle shown here in this little rounded darker circle enters into the cell and exerts its cytopathic effects, leading to apoptosis or cell death. These mechanisms and highlighting these mechanisms has been important, in fact crucial, to then identifying how the virus actually causes us injury at the cellular level. And so for me, when I try to delineate the pulmonary manifestations of COVID-19, it really is divided into two arms for me. And I'm first going to talk about the respiratory tract or the parenchymal abnormalities that we're seeing with COVID-19. So radiographic features. We know that the X-ray, obviously the most commonly used test, is good, but there's now more literature that has talked about characteristic findings and not so characteristic findings. And for physicians, ordinary physicians who are dealing with being able to diagnose COVID upfront, I think these findings should be very well understood. So generally, characteristic findings include either the peripheral or the lower lung zone involvement. On the left hand of the screen here is a characteristic X-ray. You can see that there's also a very patchy band-like structure, mostly in the periphery of the lung, which is a major feature of this illness. The arrows here point to these abnormalities that I'm talking about. The non-specific findings, again, the second X-ray here shown on the right hand of the screen is also referring to a patient with COVID-19. However, you can see that this patient has more central or perihilar upper lobe involvement, which has not historically been said to be the characteristic findings. And so, although this patient's been diagnosed with COVID, these are considered non-specific findings. So building on this, I'm going to share another example of another X-ray where this individual, again, was suspected to have a viral respiratory illness. The initial X-ray was completely normal, and a day apart, a CT scan showed these subtle ground glass opacities in the right lower lobe of the lung. And so that tells us that the utility of the chest X-ray in diagnosing COVID-19 is not very sensitive, meaning it doesn't pick up all the cases, but when it does pick up the very characteristic findings, it has a very high specificity to tell you that this is COVID. So the characteristic findings on an X-ray will almost always lead you to the correct diagnosis. A chest X-ray hence has a limited diagnostic value in the early stages of illness because the nature is the subtle ground glass that we see in viral infections, and that often an X-ray is not the best modality to choose to diagnose those infections. Moving on to CT imaging. So CT findings are likely to be apparent even before symptom onset, meaning that between the incubation and the asymptomatic phases, you may get individuals who get incidental CTs and find that there are changes that are predictive of COVID. And we've seen this in the inpatient setting where patients have been admitted for operative procedures and been found to have COVID-19, etc. And it can also be positive in cases of false negative RT-PCR. Here I want to add that a group from Stanford and a couple of other large medical centers have actually had such a steep learning curve that they've been able to recognize the pattern that we see on COVID, that we see in COVID, and they've actually, diagnosed COVID based on just the radiographic findings alone. So it really is a very steep learning curve. The findings on a CT will vary with age, your immune status, the stage at which your disease is diagnosed, and the underlying comorbidities. And more we're seeing that the residual effects of COVID-19 will persist if you're older in age or if you've got a weaker immune system, etc. The American College of Radiology, as of now, does not recommend that CT should be used as a first-line test to diagnose COVID-19, and they recommend that it should be reserved for symptomatic patients who have a specific indication to undergo a CT scan. For example, if you're following the trajectory of illness and it doesn't really fit into what you would expect with COVID or any other normal etiology of bacterial pathogens, then you should perhaps proceed to a CT with all necessary precautions to protect your healthcare staff and perform the CT. Features that are highly suggestive as of the most recent literature. Again, ground glass consolidation, occasionally crazy paving is probably the most well-reported feature of this illness. Infiltrates are usually patchy, meaning they're scattered in separate areas of the lung. It tends to be bilateral but can be unilateral in early disease, as I showed you in that last X-ray and the CT scan. It tends to be basal predominant. I've got an asterisk next to the very high yield words here like basal predominance and ground glass and consolidation. And then of course peripheral, like as I pointed out earlier, you can occasionally get rounded or nodular opacities as well. And then some of my colleagues have started to see organizing pneumonia as a delayed presentation as well. I would argue that the bilateral patchy initial presentation is also sometimes befitting organizing pneumonia injury. Features that are not present with COVID-19. So for example, distinct lobar consolidation as you would see with, for example, Klebsiella pneumonia or even staphylococcal pneumonia or strep pneumonia, for example, is not the hallmark of COVID-19. A lack of ground glass really does go against the presence of COVID. Cavitation is also not a hallmark of initial COVID. I will add here that the delayed effects of COVID, sometimes untreated COVID, we are seeing patients present with these unusual cavities that are not explained by any other infection. And so that may be a delayed feature of COVID. Lymphadenopathy is not a typical feature. Pleural effusion formations are also not a typical feature. And so in early disease, one can see these perihilar infiltrates, as I've shown you here. Again, the base of the lung is involved. If the anterior periphery of the lung is involved, it can look perihilar on this X-ray. And so if left alone, this gentleman can develop a CT that looks like this. This was an X-ray of a real patient that we had who was admitted with fever, dry cough for 3 days. And he had this X-ray when he first came in. However, because of diagnostic uncertainty, we proceeded with obtaining a CT scan. And I think the images are about a day and a half apart, not more than that. And you can see that the subtle findings on a chest X-ray are really quite vividly apparent on a cross-sectional CT. If you've got intermediate presentation, for example, you've got about 3 to 7 days of symptoms and you've come in a little later to the hospital, these opacities may look more grid-like in structure. They're still patchy and they're almost bordering on becoming consolidated, but not just yet. They've got that almost moth-eaten appearance where you can see areas of low density within that patch. And if spread out over a larger area, this would look like a crazy paving pattern as well. I want to reiterate here that the bilateral patchy consolidation nature here actually fits ARDS at this point. So even though this is not the hallmark X-ray of a patient with ARDS, these infiltrates, when they exist for longer and become more solid, fits the Berlin definition of ARDS. And so when you move on to an even more later presentation, for example, about 7 to 14 days later, the same individuals will now develop a fully formed consolidated patch in the areas of the lung previously affected. And so this was a comparison of a 50-year-old lady who had initially presented with anorexia and nasal congestion for about a week, and then later on went on to develop this dense consolidation in her lung. This is a patient that we actually saw at the intensive care unit at our university, and this gentleman presented with about 7 days of progressive dyspnea. So he'd had symptoms even longer, but he had specifically shortness of breath for about 7 days at home, and when things really were unbearable, he came in rushing to the hospital. And here you can see that the entire periphery of the lung is opacified, is this band of whitish structure all the way from the lower to the upper lung zones, and it is visible bilaterally. And so this gentleman had almost 2 PCRs that were negative, but his symptoms were so typical, and his chest radiograph also, that we had to proceed with getting a CT scan just to be sure. This was very early in the illness, and there was still a lot of diagnostic dilemma in terms of radiography for us. And you can see that the same X-ray has a very distinct early consolidation and ground glass appearance in the periphery and the bases of the lung. So I would say that the CT scan on the right is probably the most typical of the series of X-rays and CTs that I've shown you. And so I found this timeline sort of very useful in my mind. When somebody presents early, they're more likely to either have a normal CT imaging, have early consolidation, and will have bilateral disease. But as you get more intermediate into your illness, you're more likely to be consolidated, have more profuse bilateral involvement, and more profuse peripheral involvement. And if you present very late in the illness, you're likely to just have receding bilaterality and peripheral disease, and you're more likely to develop now these linear band-like opacities that are otherwise unexplained by any other illness. And so comparing it to an RT-PCR, again, the benefits of an RT-PCR still remain. It is still the gold standard. It's got a sensitivity but a very good specificity as compared to a chest CT, where the specificity depends really on the learning curve of the person who's reading it. This is again due to evolve as our understanding of the disease improves. And so I wanted to also talk about the histopathology, the lung histopathology of COVID-19, where I think the entire understanding of this disease lies. And so in an acute respiratory distress syndrome, so I know that the disease has been linked with influenza, ARDS, etc., other ARDS syndromes. It is true that the coronavirus also presents with acute respiratory distress syndrome, but there are subtle differences. So this is a typical radiograph of a patient who has bilateral alveolar infiltrates, the textbook presentation of ARDS as we understand it. You can see that the basal lung zones are involved, and again, that's a predominant area that is heavily inundated with edema. The CT scan for this relevant individual will be something like this. But if you look at the actual pathological damage, what has been extremely well described all the way from the 1970s onwards is a distinct formation of hyaline membranes, these little pink areas that develop around the alveolar lining, and that are the pathognomonic feature of diffuse alveolar damage. In the organizing phases, as diffuse alveolar damage progresses, you see, again, areas that are filled with fibroblasts, intraalveolar fibrin deposition. You still see those hyaline membranes. And occasionally you may see thrombi inside the vessels themselves. So the point of this slide is that acute respiratory distress syndrome has a hallmark feature of diffuse alveolar damage, or DAD, again, characterized by all those changes that I just described. But this is a non-specific finding that can be seen in patients with the MERS, the SARS-CoV, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, influenza, as well as non-infectious insults such as even trauma that has nothing to do with infection. And so really, all this slide is telling you is that DAD is the way that the lung reacts to a very severe reaction or an insult posed upon it. The other thing that I wanted to point out with this slide is that the formation of clots has been described with previous illnesses such as influenza as well. The influenza ARDS lungs, so the specimen will look something like this. You can see how edematous and inflamed it looks, ready to burst on itself, and the cellular infiltrate is profuse throughout almost all sections of the lung infrastructure. This lung is likely to have a very high lung weight, a poor compliance because all of the inflammation and the infrastructure is now just full of extracellular infiltrates and edema, and as lung is very hard to stretch. But this lung also tends to be more recruitable, hence the procedures that we use, for example, proning and the high PEEP and the BiPAP, for instance, that helps inflate and distend this section of the lung. The second feature here is that the ARDS-related thrombosis is almost always the result of endothelial injury. So the point that I'm trying to make here is influenza or any other form of ARDS will have some degree of endothelial injury that can then manifest as clotting in addition to the cellular inflammation that we know it causes. In COVID ARDS, about 20% of all cases will have a presentation like this, meaning the intensely inflamed edematous lung of typical influenza ARDS. And this may be about 40% of hospitalized patients. But what is a little bit more unusual about COVID is that it is not always presenting in that ARDS characterization. It does not always have those typical findings of ARDS as we know it. This disease tends to involve more of the periphery of the lung. Here I've attached here a gross specimen that shows distinctly the periphery of the lung that is way more engorged than the actual central lung parenchyma. And this is also shown on the histopathology specimen where the cellular infiltrate is far more profuse on the periphery than it is towards the proximal parts of the lung. And so a peripheral, predominantly interstitial, very vascular, lymphocytic, multifocal endotheliitis are some of the key hallmark features of COVID-19 injury. In this particular specimen, which again, this was an article published in the NEJM, they had about 7 lung patients in whom they did an autopsy with COVID-19, and they found that almost all of them had the typical diffuse alveolar damage, but 4 out of 7 had focal damage, and about a little less than half had homogeneity. So that's another feature where COVID-19 tends to cause that focal type of injury rather than homogeneous injury. And so that brings me to the second type of pulmonary manifestations of COVID-19, in addition to the respiratory, which is the vascular abnormalities that we think it causes. And so this brings me to the physiological role of the ACE2 inhibitor, where you've got the ACE2 binding endothelial, ACE2 receptors on the endothelial lining of different capillary structures. There is also significant upregulation of the ACE2 gene, followed by, again, the intense mechanism which leads to really what boils down to is a combat between the effects of angiotensin 2 and the effects of angiotensin. So it turns out that ACE2 facilitates the conversion of angiotensin 2 to angiotensin. And angiotensin tends to be a little bit more of a friendlier hormone for us in terms of vasodilation and an anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic effects. There are also other new reports that the bradykinin hypothesis or the pathway may be affected. And so the message from this slide is really that the balance between the evil forces, for example, the ones that cause more vasoconstriction and pro-inflammation in the lung, may be superseding the beneficial forces in the lung as mediated by angiotensin 2. So really it is the balance between the ACE2 and the effects of ACE in the lung, which determines what force wins and causes lung injury. So this was, again, another article that talked about at length about endotheliitis and angiogenesis in COVID-19. This is a gross specimen of an individual from COVID-19, and all I wanted to show you here is that you can actually see micro and macrovascular thrombus happening. So these are the large pulmonary vessels which have clot within them. And then you can see the lung parenchyma, which is engorged and has evidence of microthrombi formation as well. And so when you look at electron micrographs of these patients, these, both influenza and COVID-19 happen to have similar numbers of precapillary thrombi formation without complete luminal obstruction. But what's distinct about COVID is that the alveolar capillary membrane and the thrombi are almost 9 times more prevalent in COVID-19 than in patients with influenza. And I've given you here some reference numbers for the number of distinct thrombi that they saw per square meter of lung. And so that tells us how much of the vasculature is affected. This is the same image that I wanted to show you how in COVID-19 you can see how unhealthy the vascular structure appears to be, and the lumen is again quite seriously narrowed as opposed to normal lung architecture. The second pathogenic feature in the endothelium that we're noticing is the presence of faulty angiogenesis. where we are noticing that as per the normal lung, the channels between the arteries and the veins, again the afferent and the efferent segments are nice and smooth. However, in COVID-19, we're seeing more of intussusceptive angiogenesis or sprouting angiogenesis, where again there's a very unhealthy growth of vessels, in fact even dividing into separate vessels here, giving the lung an extremely unhealthy, almost canalicular distribution of blood flow. This image may explain why the lung seems to be appearing where it almost has these abnormal vascular channels at the bases of the lung, and by measures such as proning and postural changes in the body can help improve oxygenation, because it really just helps divert blood flow and improve VQ mismatch in lung structure like this. Again, I mentioned sprouting angiogenesis, and then I talked about how this angiogenesis is also seen to increase as the duration of hospitalization increases. So meaning that the longer people stayed in the hospital, the more likely they were to have evidence of angiogenesis of this sort. This is an electromicrograph of the same individual, breaking it down to the basics of pulmonary physiology, where you can see that the normal architecture of the lung has now become extremely unhealthy, with sprouting of different vessels that are not necessarily contributing to oxygenation in the lung. So lung pathobiology covers really the fact that you see DAD and perivascular lymphocytic infiltration, just like influenza. You've got three distinct angiocentric features, for example, the fact that you've got severe endothelial injury from the intracellular entry of SARS-CoV. You've got widespread vascular thrombosis and microangiopathy and occlusion of capillaries, and you've got significant new vessel growth, such as intussusceptive angiogenesis. Tissue hypoxia is a common feature in both groups, but a greater degree of endotheliitis in COVID-19 may contribute to the relative frequency of why this angiogenesis takes place in the first place, meaning that this angiogenesis may actually be a reaction to the intense hypoxia that's taking place inside COVID lung. Pulmonary vascular manifestations have been studied in a number of journal articles. This review here quoted about a 15% incidence of pulmonary embolism. They all had a higher D dimer if they developed a PE. Patients were seen to have dilated pulmonary vasculature in about 85% individuals, and the dilated distal vessels were seen to be extended into the pleura and the fissures as well. The frequent and the pronounced dilatation of the vasculature to regions of diseased lung may be suggestive of the disordered vasoregulation that is seen, leading to significant ventilation and perfusion mismatch even early in the disease itself. This would explain the fact that there is hypoxemia, but there's a lot of normal lung compliance because of abnormal vascular channels. The pulmonary vascular manifestations have also been studied in detail by advanced imaging, and here I'll really just summarize what this shows. This is a 69-year-old who presented with these what would appear like ground glass opacities, but when advanced imaging was done, it was shown that these opacities actually coincide with a distinct lack of perfusion, and there's a halo around them that suggests that there is increased perfusion in the surrounding lung. You can also see that the vessels here are dilated. And what this really suggests is that there is blockage of blood flow to the periphery of the lung that then appears as ground glass or band-like consolidation. It really just may be a vascular limitation of blood flow and hence lung injury. So these elements of lung injury are very important to recognize. This is a similar image where I'm just going to highlight the fact that there is a distinct dilatation of blood vessels, the fact that also the posterior section of the lung is more dilated in terms of its blood perfusion, but it's also the one that's more injured. And the anterior section of the lung, you can see here, doesn't have dilatation of blood vessels and doesn't have as much of the ground glass that we see in the posterior section of the lung. So long-term outcomes very quickly. So lessons from the past pandemics that we've had, the SARS-CoV-1 between 2002 and 2004 that caused a major outbreak had an overall mortality of about 11%. And at 1 year follow-up for these patients, cough, sputum, shortness of breath, and wheezing persisting on most days of the month was seen in about a third of the patients. 1/3 had a mild pulmonary function limitation, of which the FEV1 and DLCO were probably the most compromised. But the DLCO did improve at 3 to 12 months by about 8%. What is very significant is that almost all of these patients had a decline in their health status as measured by the St. George Respiratory Questionnaire. And so there was no significant association between how sick you were and what your outcome in terms of pulmonary function was in these pandemics, at least at the 1 year mark. Long-term follow-up of general ARDS survivors, again at the 3-month, 6-month, and then the 12-month mark, you can see that most parameters return to normal, including the FPC, the FEV1, total lung capacity. However, the carbon monoxide diffusion capacity or the DLCO measurement may remain in a slightly mild to moderate limited zone. And the DLCO seems to be the most significant marker of residual lung injury in these patients. ARDS survivors also see a limitation in their 6-minute walk test. Again, here shown here in the value that only about 66% of them return to their predicted value at 12 months, and almost about a third, a little about close to half, were able to return to work at the end. The reason I'm showing you these numbers is because we can extrapolate what happens in COVID-19 based on these studies that we already know. ARDS survivors also witness extreme loss of weight, and they're also known to have persistent functional limitation, including muscle wasting, entrapment, and severe critical illness neuropathy that may persist up to a year later. Long-term outcomes in terms of COVID specifically, again, there are not a whole lot of studies that are out there yet because it just simply hasn't been that long. And I would argue that we're still seeing some of the more delayed manifestations of COVID that we're still learning. However, it can be seen that about from day 0 to about 7 days later to about a month later and then about 5 months later, there is a consistent resolution in the areas affected with the fact that you're left with a band-like opacity in the periphery of the lung. I would note that the elevated D-dimer level is consistently shown to be correlated with a DLCO impairment downstream. And so this is data at least up to 3 months later. How ill your chest X-ray looks correlates with how bad your DLCO is, but the rest of the lung markers seem to be less affected in COVID-19. And very quickly here, I wanted to draw a comparison to some of the worst viruses that mankind has seen, the H5N1, where almost 100% of them developed fibrosis at 6 months. The H7N1 influenza virus, again, with a large proportion developed fibrosis downstream. SARS-CoV, about a third, a little less than a quarter of patients seem to be developing those fibrotic elements as well. And so my final 2 slides, what to expect with COVID-19. We expect that dyspnea as a pulmonary symptom will typically develop about 7 to 8 days after symptom onset. A peripheral and bibasal ground glass and consolidation is most characteristic. SARS-CoV differs from past viruses in that there is a high rate of DIC and thromboembolic disease, and prolific thrombosis and angiogenesis may be behind a deeply hypoxic yet normal lung compliance pattern of lung injury. Up to a third of patients may suffer some form of pulmonary impairment at about a year follow-up. Admission D-dimers will correlate with a high likelihood of thromboembolism or pulmonary arterial hypertension in these patients. We expect that these patients will have reduced health status scores based on their bone and their muscular wasting. And then the long-term follow-up for chest imaging of survivors is needed because we still need to have a better understanding of the possible irreversible pulmonary damages of SARS-CoV-2. With that, I'm going to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Masuma, for an excellent presentation, very comprehensive, succinct.